The two armies are arrayed at Kurukṣetra in the gray of early morning. Conches have been blown. The sound dies. Between the blowing of those horns and the release of the first arrow, time seems to suspend itself, and in that suspension, in that narrow, impossible gap, one of the most searching conversations in the history of human thought begins to unfold. Arjuna, the third son of Pandu, renowned throughout the known world as an archer of incomparable skill, asks his charioteer to drive to the center of the battlefield. He wants to see who has come to fight. Kṛṣṇa drives the chariot forward, and Arjuna looks. He sees his grandfather Bhishma. He sees his teacher Dronacharya. He sees uncles, cousins, friends, men he has eaten with, laughed with, grown alongside. And something inside him breaks. His limbs tremble. His mouth goes dry. The bow slips from his hand. The man who could shoot arrows with either hand, whose very epithet, Sva-dharma, the ambidextrous archer, announced his mastery, cannot lift the weapon that has defined his whole life. This is how the Bhagavad Gītā begins, not with philosophical triumph, with collapse. The first chapter of the Gita carries a name that deserves to be held for a moment: Arjuna Vishada Yoga. Vishada from the Sanskrit root meaning to sink, to dissolve, to fall into dejection. The chapter of Arjuna's despondency is called a yoga, a discipline, a practice, a path. The ancient editors were making a careful claim: even grief, even collapse, can be the beginning of a genuine reckoning. The fall is the first movement of the teaching. But before we follow Krishna's response, we need to understand precisely what Arjuna is doing in this moment of crisis. He is not simply feeling compassion for his family, though he believes that is what he is doing. He is, according to Krishna's eventual diagnosis, substituting another's duty for his own. He is reaching for para-dharma, para meaning other, another's, and dressing it in the language of virtue. He tells Kṛṣṇa he cannot bear to cause the death of these people, that non-violence is the higher path, that renunciation and withdrawal are nobler than warfare. And there is real feeling behind those words. He is not lying. But feeling, however genuine, can still cloud discriminative intelligence, what the text calls buddhi. The condition that has set in is moha, delusion, the clouding of the mind, and beneath it is an older error the text names mamakara, mindness, the compulsive identification of self with what belongs to me, my teacher, my grandfather, my kin. Kṛṣṇa, in the first chapter, says almost nothing. He waits, he sits in the chariot, composed, watching his friend fall apart, and he waits until Arjuna explicitly asks to be taught. This restraint is itself a teaching. Wisdom cannot be poured into a vessel that is not yet open. At the opening of chapter 2, Kṛṣṇa begins with a diagnosis before he offers a cure. The term he uses is karpanya dosha, the fault of small-spiritedness, from karpanya, meaning miserliness or faint-heartedness, and dosha, fault or defect. What looks like noble compassion is, on examination, a contraction of the spirit. It is pettiness masquerading as virtue. That distinction is merciless and precise, and it cuts to the center of the problem. Then Kṛṣṇa makes his first direct appeal to Arjuna's identity as a warrior. The verse is Bhagavad Gītā 2, verse 31. Sva-dharmam api chaveksha navikampitum arhasi, dharmyati yuddhat shreyo nyat kshatriyasya navidyate. Considering even your own duty, you should not waver. For a warrior, there is indeed no better engagement than fighting for righteousness. The word that carries the weight here is Sva-dharma. Sva means self, own. Dharma comes from the root dhr, to hold, to sustain. Sva-dharma is one's own sustaining law, the duty that upholds the particular being that you are, given your nature, your formation, your situation, this precise moment. This is the architectural center of the Gita's ethical teaching, and it is worth resisting the temptation to flatten it into something familiar. Sva-dharma is not, the text is careful to show us, simply doing what you love. For Arjuna, Sva-dharma required him to do the very thing that caused him the deepest pain. The divine did not say, follow your passion. The divine said, do not waver from what you are, and from what this moment requires of you. The fullest statement of this principle comes in chapter 3, verse 35, at the close of the Karma Yoga chapter. Kṛṣṇa has been pressing toward the practical application of wisdom in ordinary life. Arjuna has asked why human beings are driven toward destructive choices even against their own better judgment. Kṛṣṇa identifies desire and aversion, raga and dvesha, as the enemies of clear discernment, and then he arrives at the paradigmatic verse, Shreyan Sva-dharma vigunah, parat dharmat svanushtitat, Sva-dharme nidhanam shreyah, parat dharmo bhayavaha. Better is one's own duty, though imperfectly performed, than the duty of another, well performed. Better is death in the doing of one's own duty. The duty of another is fraught with peril. The word that opens the verse is shreyan, better, superior in the deepest sense, the kind of better that concerns long-term human flourishing rather than immediate satisfaction. And the word that follows, vigunah, means defective, imperfect, slightly flawed. Kṛṣṇa does not say, pursue your own dharma once you have mastered it. He says, pursue it even when it is imperfect. The verse is not a counsel of perfectionism. It is a counsel of authentic engagement over borrowed excellence. Parat dharma bhayavaha. The duty of another brings fear, danger, peril. Bhayavaha comes from bhaya, fear, and avaha, that which carries or brings. When we perform a life that belongs to someone else's nature, even if we perform it skillfully, even if the world applauds it, something in us knows it is borrowed. And that knowledge, however suppressed, carries its own quiet terror. Consider someone in their late 30s who has spent a decade doing the thing their family needed them to do, taking over a role, staying in a city, maintaining a stability that everyone around them required. They are competent, they are even praised. But in the hours when the house is quiet, there is an exhaustion that sleep does not touch. Not because the work is wrong in itself, but because it was built from someone else's blueprint. The Gītā would not diagnose this as ingratitude or selfishness. It would call it the slow accumulation of bhayavaha, the low-grade fear that comes from living inside a life that was never quite yours. Now Kṛṣṇa presses deeper into the question, where does Sva-dharma come from? Chapter 4, verse 13, supplies a crucial piece. Chaturvarnya maya srishtam guna karma vibhagashaha. The 4 categories of human vocation were created according to people's qualities and activities. The word guna here refers to the 3 fundamental dispositions that Sankhya philosophy identifies as the constituents of all nature: sattva, clarity; rajas, energy and drive; tamas, inertia and groundedness. The word karma refers to the characteristic actions that arise from those qualities. What the verse is saying, in its compressed way, is that the arrangement of human roles is rooted in inherent nature and actual work, not in hereditary transmission. This is a point the text's interpreters have debated seriously for centuries, and the debate has not been resolved. What can be said with confidence is that Kṛṣṇa explicitly grounds social and ethical function in guna and karma, innate quality and action, and that the Gīta's Sva-dharma teaching consistently points inward to svabhava, one's own inherent being, as the root of right action. The teaching is not at its philosophical core about which family you were born into. It is about what you fundamentally are. This is made most explicit in the final chapter of the Gītā, verse 18, verse 47, a verse that nearly repeats the language of 335, but adds a phrase that changes everything. Svabhava niyatam karma kurvan napnoti kilbisham. By performing action regulated by one's own inherent nature, one does not incur fault or sin. The new phrase, svabhava niyatam, means regulated by or flowing from one's own svabhava, one's own being. The causal chain is now complete and explicit. Svabhava gives rise to Sva-dharma, Sva-dharma gives shape to karma, and action that flows through this chain, from the inside out, carries no kilbisha, no fault. The contrast with 335 is precise. In chapter 3, Kṛṣṇa says imperfect own duty is better than perfect other duty. In chapter 18, he says Action arising from your own nature leaves no residue of guilt. The first verse is a comparison. The second is a declaration of freedom. When what you do grows from what you genuinely are, the action does not accumulate the particular kind of burden that comes from chronic inauthenticity. But Sva-dharma is not a fixed and permanent identity. The factual tradition is careful on this point. One's Sva-dharma is applicable to one's context, situation, maturity, and stage of life. It moves with you as you grow. The ashrama system, the 4 stages of brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha, sannyasa, acknowledges that what upholds you at 30 may not be what upholds you at 60. This is not inconsistency. It is the recognition that the self is not static, and its sustaining law must be honest about the stage it is actually in. Think of someone in the middle years of a long marriage, watching a parent lose their memory piece by piece. The person they were before this, the one who had a social life, plans, a sense of forward motion, has quietly receded. What is asked of them now is a constancy they never trained for. And there is no applause, no external validation. The question Sva-dharma presses is not whether they want to be doing this. The question is whether this is, honestly and precisely, what this moment of their life requires of them. That can be a terrible question, and it can also be the most clarifying one available. There is one more element the text asks us to understand, and it is the one that prevents Sva-dharma from collapsing into mere self-assertion. Kṛṣṇa says at 2:47, Karman yevadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. You have the right to perform your prescribed duty, but you are not entitled to the fruits of action. Sva-dharma performed with attachment to outcome is still a kind of ego project. The doctrine of niskama karma, action without desire for reward, is not separate from Sva-dharma. It is the spirit in which Sva-dharma must be enacted. Arjuna ultimately does fight, but not because he wanted victory or recognition. The text is precise about this. When there is no personal desire attached to the performance, the action becomes selfless. The doing of one's own duty, offered without demand for particular results, is the closest the Gita comes to a definition of integrity. What to carry forward into your actual day, the Gita does not offer Sva-dharma as a permission slip to pursue comfort or preference. It offers it as something harder. The obligation to be truthful about what your actual nature requires of you, in the actual stage of life you are in, at the actual cost that fidelity may carry. When you find yourself reaching for a borrowed life, performing someone else's role perfectly because it is easier, safer, or more legible to the people around you, the text calls that reaching by a precise name, paradharma, and it says such borrowing carries its own quiet fear. What the text asks instead is the harder courage, imperfect, honest, rooted action, flowing from who you genuinely are. The duty that sustains you is not the one that costs nothing. It is the one you cannot, in the end, honestly abandon.